All right, good evening, everybody. It is Steve with Real Progressives. Tonight, we are going to talk about modern monetary theory, but in a slightly different way. Tonight, I've got three clips, beginning with myself, and then we'll have Warren Mosler, and we'll also have Fadl Kaboub on here, talking specifically about areas of interest that you would care about as an activist, as a voter, as a real progressive. These will be issues that will matter deeply to you. The primary one here is Medicare for All. We're going to start off talking about Medicare for All, and we're going to start off with talking about expanding our minds to believe and to see a vision beyond what we think of today. The constraints we feel within ourselves, the constraints that are placed upon us by politicians and by academia, you name it, the popular opinions, the lack of wisdom, the lack of knowledge, that whole gray space where we know something's wrong but we can't quite put it all together, that area, these videos will hopefully address that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with when I spoke in Washington, D.C., there was Ro Khanna, there was Margaret Flowers, there were quite a few other individuals there that spoke. It was a nice time right there at in Washington, D.C. And what I found was that most people that were there had never heard of modern monetary theory, but more importantly, they had no idea that all these things were possible. So for me, it was a powerful moment. It was exciting to be included in such great lineup to talk, but the issue really comes down to most people don't know this. And if they don't know it, it's going to be tough to get them to fight for something that they don't know or understand. So let's go ahead and start off with my talk at the Millions for Medicare March. Thank you, Michael Rushneck, and thank you, Bev Cowling. You guys were great for inviting me. Hopefully this does it justice.
Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Grumine. I'm with Real Progressives. I am the founder of Real Progressives, and we are an organization that seeks to bring about a new deal, bring about Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights, and bring about all the things that Bernie Sanders talked about during his primaries, as well as Jill Stein. We have a huge coalition of people that want the same things. We've been balkanized by a little identity here, a little bit of an identity there, but we're all one. We're all in that 99%. And every one of us lives and breathes. Every one of us has a heart. Every one of us has lungs. And every one of us needs health care. And, Republicans love their kids too. Let's not forget that. They just don't understand economics. And we have a deficit in this country, and it's not a fiscal deficit. It's a knowledge deficit of how our monetary system works and how it can be leveraged to bring about not just onesie, twosie programs, but a massive revitalization of America, to bring about imagination and to allow people to consider what if. Years ago, we didn't question whether or not we could afford to go to the moon. We didn't question whether or not we could go to war in the Second World War. And nobody questions whether or not we can afford to bomb 7 nations right now. We have carte blanche when it comes to bombing the world. And we never ask, how are you going to pay for it? We never ask, are we going to have inflation if we drop another bomb? You never hear them talking about whether or not we can afford it. Nor should we be asking whether we can afford Medicare for all. Folks, one of the greatest myths we've ever been told is that the United States is broke. We've been told somehow or another we're in debt to China. And you watch these videos of Obama saying, what are we going to do? Take out a credit card from the People's Bank of China? And he was lying. Just like every other person across the way. Our nation is what we call monetarily sovereign. In other words, we create our own money. So we don't need to borrow US dollars from China. Think about how absurd that is on its face. Think about the fact that we had a huge chunk of ice just break off Antarctica because of environmental crisis. Think about the fact that we've got people hanging themselves because of a lack of employment. Think about the fact that people kill themselves because there's no hope. Folks, I'm here to tell you there's hope. There is real, substantive hope. Bernie Sanders came into town with a wonderful economist named Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie Kelton speaks of what they call modern monetary theory, which is the description of our monetary system since 1971, when we left the gold standard and we went on to a sovereign, free-floating fiat currency. Now, instead of allowing the 1% to use it to blow up the world, we can use it instead to save lives today. And that is exactly what Real Progressives is pushing, to save lives today, to save the planet, to make our planet inhabitable for our children. And as part of that, Medicare for All is a key linchpin to doing exactly that. Folks, we could have even better than that, but let's just go with what we can get. Medicare for All is a tremendous opportunity for all of us to begin to lead a life without fear. How many of you all have been afraid to lose your job? How many of you have been afraid, God forbid, that you run into a calamity, some sort of physical ailment, a disease? Folks, it doesn't have to be this way. And if we get passionate and we organize at the local level and we work together and we take our labels and we get rid of them and we focus on humanity, we can change this world. Folks, our enemy is not just capitalism or the Republicans or whatever. It is a global scourge called neoliberalism. And neoliberalism has got to be defeated at all costs. Neoliberalism has devastated lives. Folks, full disclosure, I was once a Republican. I have 2 master's degrees, Master of Business Administration and Master of Science in Technology Management. And the sun always shined on me until it didn't. And when it didn't, it came crashing down in a way that I can only describe as cataclysmic, devastating. I sized up the rafters to see whether or not it was time to leave this earth. It was devastating. And I have family, I have friends, I have abilities to survive through this that others don't. Folks, we live in a cruel world that doesn't have to be that way. It is up to us to be that shining light and to tell everyone that we too can have health care as a right. The rest of the world has it. There's no reason we cannot have it. None. So as you think about what's on TV, you think about what you're going to do for your summer vacations, you think about different things you're going to do, don't forget to call your senators. Don't forget to call your congresspeople. Don't forget to talk to a neighbor. Don't forget to share something on social media. And don't forget that this is possible, that we can do this. This is not pie in the sky. And let me tell you something else. This is but one small thing. What about a federal job guarantee? What about green energy? What about an infrastructure bill? What about getting rid of student debt forever? Folks, I'm telling you, our imaginations are tainted with the limitations of neoliberalism, and it's time to unshackle them. Folks, the term you want to get to know is modern monetary theory. It is not a theory at all, it's a description of the way our current federal financing works and currency works all around the globe. Get to know it. Get to know Stephanie Kelton. And by all means, come to Real Progressives, and we'll continue to advance this fight with you one by one. And I want to thank you, Michelangelo. You are an inspiration to me, sir. I had no idea everything you put into this, and I want to thank you. And Beverly, thank you for inviting me. And Michael, thank you for inviting me. And to the other folks that are going to be on here, thank you, Margaret Flowers. Thank you, Rokana. And most importantly, I can't wait to hear Nina, but thank you all for having me. Good day, everybody.
All right, folks, that was me a few pounds ago. But the message is the same. You can go back, roll the tape. You can see for years I have said the same things. I'm not a broken record. I recognize that people still haven't quite grasped it. Their vision, their dreams are not big enough. Their desires are not pungent enough. They don't believe that they can do these things. There's a fundamental flaw, a lack of belief, a lack of faith that we too can do these things together. And as I watched that video, I remember the strength that I felt having an organization like Real Progressives backing me up, and having the friendships with the modern monetary theorists and other fellow activists who have found this and know this to be true and are willing to go down for the cause and fight like hell. So part of this thing, after the whole rally went down, I had talked to Warren Mosler some time ago about Medicare for All. And his description of Medicare for All and his indictment, if you will, on the headline left and the typical tax and spend approach to economics, as it were, was pretty shocking. It was an eye-opener for me. And as part of my continuing growth, I found his description of how we pay for Medicare for All to be incredibly enlightening. But the people afterwards were asking me all kinds of questions. I mean, people were yearning for it because they felt real hope. Now, people may turn their back on you because they get in little cliques and they get in little groups and they say, oh, modern monetary theory, whatever. But I'm telling you right now, one-on-one, when I look people in the eye and I'm face-to-face with them, I don't get that bullshit pushback. People stop and listen. Now, it could be that I'm 6 foot, 200 and some pounds. I'm assuming it's because they just love the hope. But regardless, let's listen to what Warren Mosler has to say about paying for Medicare for all.
Now, the other thing I want to say about Medicare for All, which we tried to get through to Bernie Sanders, but without success, obviously, is I see it as a highly deflationary event. So right now I see, I'll just use very, very round numbers, but $3 trillion spent on healthcare. Out of that, $1 trillion in the private sector is private sector administration. That's pretty much going to go away if we go Medicare for All. But what does that mean if that spending goes away? Well, all those were all salaries going to, people who were like digging one hole and filling in another, which is what private sector, compared with, well, let's just say they were doing all the administration work. I'm not saying what they were doing wasn't valuable in its context, but the context had no value. But anyway, you had $1 trillion worth of wages and salaries going to people doing administration that aren't going to be there anymore. That's a highly deflationary event. All those people are going to be out of work in the unemployment lines looking for jobs. You don't raise taxes in that context. That makes no sense at all. You'd want to lower taxes or increase public spending somewhere else in that context. Now, yes, there will be other people spending more money to make up for it. Corporations will have lower healthcare costs, so they may be spending more on something else. People may be getting higher salaries. People will be, have lower healthcare costs. There won't be any healthcare premiums if it's Medicare for All, very little. Maybe you get a little bit of Part B or something. But and so there will be some inflationary biases, but I think the deflationary bias, at least initially, will dominate. So there's absolutely no reason to pay for Medicare for All with a tax increase like the Sanders campaign was putting out there. And it was a horrible tax. It was a regressive, punishing tax, even though it was supposedly on higher incomes. And the whole thing was, would have been led to, I think, 15 or 20% unemployment. I was like just categorically against that, raising taxes into a. Now that I'm thinking back on the taxes, they attempted it to be progressive, so I give them credit for that. But it would have wound up increasing unemployment, which is always a regressive phenomenon. dramatically. And it didn't have to be. And think of how much stronger the campaign would have been explaining it. Look, this is a deflationary event. You don't raise taxes for that. You don't pay for it that way. Okay. And you say, well, what about the deficit? You say, look, the public debt are the dollars spent by government that haven't yet been used to pay taxes. They sit in the accounts at the Fed called Treasury securities. What's the problem? While in the year 2030, the CBO reports the deficit's going to be $77 trillion in 20 years. They say, look, if the only problem a deficit spending can cause is inflation. So what you do is you look to the long-term inflation forecast, and they'll tell you if you have a deficit problem. Well, the long-term inflation forecasts are the CBO says 2%, the Fed says 2%, and your precious free market Treasury index bonds say something less than 2%. Okay, and I don't think 2% is an inflation problem. So what they're telling us is that even with today's budgets, even without making any adjustments at all, we're not going to have an inflation problem, which means somehow, so look, the burden of proof, if you think there's a deficit problem, the burden of proof is on you to show me there's an inflation problem. And so the burden of proof is on you to show me that the Fed, the CBO, and the free market is wrong with their inflation forecast. And if you can do that, fine, then I'll listen to you and take a look at whether or not we have a deficit problem. Okay, but he couldn't do that either. And so those were the two answers to any possible question on the public debt. It's just the dollars spent that haven't been used to pay taxes. It sits in accounts. What's the problem? And if there's, if there's no long-term deficit problem, even though the headline left, like Krugman and Reich, all these guys concede there's a headline deficit problem, they're wrong. The burden of proof is on them to show me that there's a long-term inflation problem, which means the Fed, the CBO, and the market is wrong. And until then, I don't see a long-term deficit problem. Anyway, they couldn't do that. And so we have what we have.
All right, so there's Warren Mosler. And what did he just say? Let me boil it down to about 10 sentences. Warren Mosler just told you that Medicare is actually a deflationary event, that Medicare itself may actually require a tax cut. When there's inefficiency and there's chaos, there's a lot of financial activity that comes through with very inefficient situations. Inefficiency, all this red tape, etc., is all a moneymaker in some way, shape, or form. It's all changing money through all kinds of different ways. And by doing that, by slimming it down, by trimming it out, you've ultimately created a deflationary situation. So Mosler's sitting there saying, hey, headline left's not going to listen to me. Reich, Krugman, these guys, prove to me there's an inflation problem. If you can't, I'm not listening to you. And no one should listen to anyone that says there's an inflation problem that can't prove it. And they can't, because it's non-existent. So how important is it to know MMT? I'd say pretty damn important. I'd say it's pretty damn important. And, we're talking about a Green New Deal, so it goes beyond just Medicare for All, right? If you think about my speech in D.C., you saw I tried to lay out the entirety of what I saw as the New Deal. And this is long before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez advanced the idea of her version of the Green New Deal. And it had also come because we have been talking about a New Deal. We have been New Dealers at RP since the beginning. And when the Green Party put forward their version of the Green New Deal, we supported most of it. There's some wonky stuff in there that folks are just... It was a lot of neat ideas that some people that didn't understand economics tried to plug some things into. And you know what? That's okay, because the bulk of it was in the spirit of what a good progressive agenda should look like. So we naturally supported it. So what happens? We start expanding the realm of what our vision is. Start expanding our imagination. Start dreaming a better dream. And start getting to the point where we say anything is possible, because it is. Anything really is possible. So, Graham Elwood of the Progressive Vigilante, you see him with Jimmy Dore and others. This is a guy who had been introduced a couple different times to MMT I believe Jeff Epstein was the first one to take a shot. And anyway, Fidel Kaboob and Stephen Hale and a few others went on there. Graham, I'm available if you ever want to talk to somebody. And bottom line is that Fidel Kaboob ran game. He really provided what I would like to call the ultimate light bulb moment for Graham Elwood. And he talked about how we're going to fund a Green New Deal. So rather than babble, let me give you Fidel.
So what if we tax pollution out of existence, right? If we discourage all of the pollution, then what do? How do we how do we fund the rest of, the fight against climate change? Because, we're way, over our heads when it comes to running this battle. And I'll give you a very simple example that most Americans will understand, because it's pretty straightforward and it's well taught in history. It's just a little bit of twist that confuses people typically. World War II came right after the Great Depression, the most miserable economic time in U.S. history. No question about it. There's books and movies and stories about it. Everybody knows the Great Depression. But then everybody knows also the history of World War II and the massive amount of production and military might that was put into place in a matter of months, right after the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, we were told that everybody was broke. There was no money. There was no money to be taxed to fund anything, right? It was miserable. And then all of a sudden, all of this massive military might was built. We moved from 25% unemployment to zero unemployment. We had to go beyond zero unemployment. We had to bring women into the labor force, retire people into the labor force just to keep up with the production for the war effort. And that's a massive boom in economic activity. How did we pay for it? Was there ever a debate in US Congress about who are we going to tax in order to fund the war? Or where is the money going to come from? Money was created into existence because there is a consensus. This is something that has to be done. We have the technology, we have the manpower, we have the resources, and we need to do it because it's the right thing to do. There was no question about money. People worked, were paid on time, so there was money created by the federal government. Things got done, right? We marshaled all the resources to get the public purpose that we wanted to achieve. Nobody was taxed to fund the war. But then people say, oh, the government borrowed money. Well, again, there was no money to be borrowed, right? We were in the midst of the Great Depression. The borrowing that most people talk about, the freedom bonds that the Treasury sold, they called them freedom bonds because they wanted to capitalize on the patriotic mood of the nation. Freedom bonds were not sold before the war. They were sold during the war. So money was already spent into existence. People had a lot of cash in their pockets. And like any normal person during that time, what would you do with your money? You want to buy a new car, you want to buy a new house, you want to spend it. But the entire city of Detroit, industrial system in Detroit, was shifted away from producing cars to producing military equipment. There were no new car models during the first 3 years of the war, because everything was dedicated to the war. So even if you wanted to buy a new house or a new car, you wouldn't find it because everybody was working mostly for. So this would have caused inflation. If everybody went out and started bidding up house prices and car prices, we would have a serious issue of inflation. So freedom bonds were sold at the time to convince the population that had a lot of cash to spend to postpone their consumption until after the war. And that's exactly what happened after the war. So the bonds that were sold was not to fund the war. The war was already in place. The funding was already there. So selling government bonds is not the same, federal government bonds is not the same thing as the state of Ohio or the state of California selling bonds. Because why would the federal government need to borrow its own money? That's kind of a silly thing. It doesn't. But the federal government needed people to postpone their spending for a while until after the war to prevent inflation and to stabilize interest rates and to stabilize financial markets. There's a whole set of reasons why federal governments sell bonds, and it's definitely not to fund anything.
Well,
this is the best example I can think of. And this is really when people tell me you can't fight this climate change on a massive scale, we have to do it kind of bit by bit, and maybe by 2050, if we're not dead, we'll put a dent in this thing. That's why I go back to this example. We can marshal the resources at a scale that the U.S. did during World War II, but dedicate this not to invading countries or destroying things, but to fixing the climate.
Well, let me ask you this before we go. What then, to the people watching this, how do people get involved, or how do people participate in this who aren't economists or scientists or whatever? How do they get involved and try to move the needle on this?
Well, for the average person who's not involved in politics, is not involved in academia, the best group that can think of is Real Progressives, which is a grassroots organization. You can find them on Facebook, on Twitter. It's sort of turning into a media company, a small media company. Lots of interviews with MMT activists and MMT economists, and legal scholars and others, environmentalists, and people running for office with an MMT informed public policy platform. Mm-hmm. You'll hear all those voices on Real Progressives. You'll get plugged into tons of resources. In terms of public policy think tanks, there's the Global Institute. Check us out on social media, on the website. There's the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College. Also, lots of my colleagues there do fantastic work. And the truth is that we're outnumbered.
All right, folks. I want you to know how much I've got like these major goosebumps. You probably can't see them right now. But when I heard Fidel's endorsement of RP, and Fidel works very, very closely with us. It's been a wonderful, wonderful thing. I love the guy immensely. But his words to Graham were so powerful, and you saw that aha moment when you realize that we were able to mobilize across the globe for warfare, but we act weak and powerless when we talk about mobilizing to save lives in our own country. When we talk about this stuff, it should not be that we only have money in time of war. It should not be that we only talk about inflation when we're talking about helping people. It should not be, and I want to close this off with a very important point. Fidel laid out all the important stuff, all the incredible economics work. He broke down the history. He explained to you point blank, time is of the essence, the Green New Deal is possible, and here's how we pay for it. But I want you to understand something. This political season makes a lot of people say a lot of really stupid things. And possibly the most ridiculous, uninformed comment is the one that talks about being purist. The ones that talk about, aren't you just going to vote blue or whatever? Because whether you end up voting blue or not is really almost secondary to the conversation about how you get to voting blue. These folks out there are given air cover before they've pushed the envelope, before they forced them to smell what's going on. I will not ever allow for, in my own personal life, I will not allow for the small-mindedness, because things are possible. Every single day we delay, we're killing somebody. Somebody without health care is dead. Somebody in a housing apartment complex that doesn't have proper regulations and doesn't have heating dies of exposure, or ends up dying from a fire like at Grenfell Towers in the UK. Every single day we delay. And I want you to know something too. I can be pretty cordial when I need to be. But I don't know how people find it more important to be gracious as people die than to just tell the truth, whether it hurts or not. I don't know how to smile and say things sweetly as people die. I just lack that ability. Call it a shortcoming. But when I know that the cause of their death is neoliberal austerity, and I know that the fix is right there, and I know that people are sitting there calling you Russian trolls because you dare stand up for the truth, that, you know what, I lose all sense of decorum. I lose all sense of propriety, and I want to do Hulk smash. Is it effective? I don't know. Back when we started RP, most people had never even heard of MMT. Here we are today. It's all over the world. It's all over the news. It's everywhere. People know it. Some people call it stupid things, but regardless, people have heard of it today. Is that all our doing? No. God, it's taken a village. It's an army. But we had our part to play, and we fought every single day. Folks, I have not taken a day off. I haven't taken a day off in over 4 years. Every single day I've been doing this. How I work this more than I work my other jobs. Probably why I've been in trouble. And the reason is because it's hope. It's hope where there is no hope. It's truth in the midst of lies. It lifts the veil. It spreads out the fog and gives you a clear shot at victory. For the people that are just saying, well, you just support the Democratic candidate, you tell me, do they understand MMT? Do they understand how to pay for a Green New Deal? Are they fighting for a Green New Deal? Are you laughing? Are you mocking? Do you understand? If you don't, then chances are I'm not the one that's got to change. It's you. If you don't understand how to save us from ourselves, it's time you followed someone that did. Instead of trying to sheep us in to just vote blue no matter who. Now, again, I'm not telling you not to vote blue. What I'm telling you is to have an informed opinion. And just voting blue is not an informed opinion. In fact, it might be the most uninformed opinion of them all. Folks, we can have a Green New Deal, and we can get health care, and we can take care of student debt, and we can eradicate so much pain and suffering. Stop wars, stop xenophobia, job guarantees, you name it. If the cynics out there and the people that don't take the time to learn will just take a minute and reverse course. I'm Steve Grumbine with Real Progressives. Have a great night, everybody. I'm out.